Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni miliwanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jed Lee, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville, in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts, in the shadow of the Great Blue Hill. We're so delighted and so honored that you are joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to subscribe to the show in the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, Stitcher Radio, Himalaya, Ghana, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Glen Mourning. He is here to celebrate his Crunchy Life series. Before we invite Glen into the studio, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by Scott Feld, the best-selling author of Dax to the Max, a Reading with Your Kids certified great read. Scott Feld is an amazing guy. His mission is to bring awareness of the inner superpowers we all have, but most of us really don't know about, and therefore we can't access it and use those powers to benefit our lives. Scott's great picture book, Dax to the Max, specifically shows kids how their imagination can trump fear in any situation. Please check out everything that Scott does at mindsinmotion.com and pick up Dax to the Max at Amazon or barnesandnoble.com. This episode is also brought to you by another incredibly inspiring author, William Wilberforce III. Please be sure to check out Vroom, Barry Carey, and the Power Boost. William Wilberforce massively weaves a powerful, playful modern-day fable that is brimming with lessons of self-confidence, determination, and positivity. With Vroom, Barry Carey, and the Power Boost, Wilberforce skillfully uses his background as a health coach and life trainer to share with young readers the importance of believing in oneself, focusing on what you can control in your life, and remaining positive and hopeful. Families and educators of young kids will welcome the invitation for discussion this joyful book brings. Vroom, Barry Carey, and the Power Boost by William Wilberforce III. Join us right now for one of my favorite spots in the entire world, Northern Virginia. Our guest is here today to celebrate a really cool middle grade novel you want to check out for your kids. It's called Crunchy Life. Please welcome to the show, Glen Mourning. Hey, Glen, how are you?
I'm doing well, sir. Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you on. Not only are you an author of middle grade books, but you are right there in the trenches. You are a fifth grade teacher, so you know what these kids are thinking and loving. And did you have that in mind when you were writing Crunchy Life?
Yeah, so in short, the motivation for writing came from this idea that I was working in D.C. at the time, in Southeast D.C., and the motivation for reading, the individual intrinsic motivation from students, rather, is what I'm referring to. It just seemed that it almost seemed like it wasn't there, right? And oftentimes teachers, we can mistake the fact that kids are just disinterested in the options with the fact that we think that they don't want to read, right? So it got to a point where I just interviewed maybe 60, 70 kids at a time within a school year. And I just kept getting the same answers. Mr. Mourning, we don't necessarily relate to Harry Potter. Mr. Mourning, the Magic Treehouse is kind of cool, but I don't really know about magic and things like that. And the plots that some of my students were mentioning, wishing to be able to read about, really just reflected their day-to-day lives. Living in, some people refer to it as like living in the inner city or urban America, and having a broken home, but being able to persevere through those challenges, right? So a lot of the plots, the subplots, my attempt to use traditional fairy tales with different renditions, a lot of it comes from just listening to the kids themselves. So when you read the Crunchy Life series, books 1 through 9, you get a sense of, oh my goodness, this sounds like it's being told right from the voice, right from the mindset of a 10-year-old boy Charles Anthony Thomas, who goes to this fictional charter school in DC. So, it has a lot to do with some of the experiences that I've had as a student myself back in the day, but also just tapping into some of the real life day-to-day struggles that kids really have that sometimes teachers avoid talking about because they're uncomfortable situations.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. We've talked a lot here on the podcast about books being mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, and how important it is for kids to see themselves portrayed in the pages of books. But as you're pointing out, it's more than just a black kid being able to see a black character in a book. It's a person that is going through the same struggles and same experiences that they're going through.
Yeah, so I mean, essentially, you take race out of the picture, right? It can be, even if you wanted to use animals, for example, right? When you have challenges that are like, oh my goodness, like that sounds like my situation. There are 5 other kids in my 1-bedroom apartment, and we have to race to the sink in the morning. You know what I mean? Like something as simple as just putting a situation in context. For example, Charles Anthony Thomas, who's the main character in the Country Life series, he is a struggling reader, and he identifies himself as a struggling reader now that he's 10 years old, and he can kind of tell why kids are picking on him. And now he's starting to get a sense that maybe school is not for me, right? So he starts to doubt himself in ways that a lot of the kids, whether you're in urban or suburban environments, a lot of students that don't have that confidence can relate to Charles because of the fact that he's starting to make those connections in terms of some of his shortcomings, right? So, you take a look at what mainstream stories have provided our children, particularly our children of color in America, with these very cliche Jamal misses the last shot in the basketball game, right? Without really hitting at the heart of, well, why couldn't Jamal sign up for the team last year, right? Because there wasn't an adult in the home responsible enough to make sure that his fees were paid and he had to ride to practice, right? Like, I grew up in an era where if you didn't have a ride to practice, man, if at 10 years old, you had to hightail it across town, right? So it's something that is transferable across time, but at the same time, we can't be afraid to meet kids where they really are without feeling, conscious of, well, I don't want to talk about the fact that this family was in a homeless shelter because, well, that's their reality, right? And if we could recognize them and, not be from a judgmental perspective, but just show them that we see them and that we're here for support, I think it's a world of a difference in terms of opening up options for kids that are reluctant readers already. Yeah.
It's interesting that you're talking about, we don't want to portray a kid in a homeless shelter because it might make them feel bad. And I don't want to make anybody feel bad. But what we're doing is we're kind of hiding that reality from all of us. And I think it's important for all of us to understand that there are kids in these different situations. There are kids who are literally 5 kids sharing a single bedroom in an apartment. Families that are living in a 1-room motel somewhere. We can't help those families, and we can't make the world better for them unless we acknowledge that these issues exist.
Yeah, I mean, and you said it, right? You're referring to the fact that if you can't see yourself in a situation, then you may not see the value, within that text itself. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, those are the highlights of any of the stories that I've written, right? But they're snapshots into a world that, children don't necessarily get to share with people. And I'll give you another example that is very spot on, right? So within the Country Life series in general, Charles Anthony Thomas, his mother works 2 jobs, right? Now, it's not uncommon, whether you're in, middle America, working on the East Coast, West Coast. Nowadays, folks have tons of different, occupations and passions. So it's not necessarily the fact that she has 2 jobs out of choice, but the fact that she can't afford to not have a second job, right? And if you think about just how kids start to realize the sacrifices their parents make, Charles starts to realize he can't fool around anymore as a 10-year-old because his mom is out here working her tail off to take care of them, right? So there's this sense of maturity, there's a sense of realization, there's a sense of, pride in the fact that he starts to see that if he wants to make something of himself and make his family proud, even as a 10-year-old, he's going to have to get his act together. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's so many layers to it. But again, these are some of the same issues that families come into literacy night with, that come into, parent-teacher conference with. So it gets to the point where we need to be we need to be more inclusive in terms of the type of scenarios that we share, but we can't lose sight of the fact that as the writers and owning the narratives, that we do want our kids to see themselves winning also.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. As a teacher, fifth grade teacher, what are some of the challenges or what are some of the reasons that lots of kids are struggling, as you called it, struggling readers?
Yeah, I mean, aside from the pandemic, which is just a completely different issue altogether, right, in terms of absenteeism, mm-hmm. or just the failure to have a consistent approach to practicing language arts skills and activities, going back 5, 10, close to 15 years ago now, it seems as if there's just this huge disconnect in different communities. Different communities have different issues, and even within a certain community, different families can be struggling with different scenarios themselves, right? Even on the same street. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to it, which, that's the first step that we need to understand and be secure in moving forward with. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, to me, having been a first grade teacher, it truly comes down to whether or not families are making time for reading and communicating early on in the home, mm-hmm. right? I give you a quick example, which is super powerful. The way that I grew up and the way that a lot of children who look like me, unfortunately, have experiences, and this is not just coming from my imagination, but I've seen it firsthand. Inside of a grocery store, you may have a parent who's in a rush, who may not have enough resources to really, get everything he or she needs. So it gets to the point where some of that frustration, it gets passed down to the children in the sense of, hey, don't touch anything in this store. Sit your little butts down. We're getting in and out. Whereas when you have more, time, when you have more patience, when you have more resources, inside of a grocery store is an opportunity for kids to learn. Mm-hmm. So instead of rushing through and grabbing things off the shelf in a hurry, and this can apply to other areas of life as well. But just a quick short example, imagine walking through the grocery store and pushing a cart, or having your 3-year-old or 4-year-old walking hand in hand, and you're pointing out different vegetables that have multi-syllables, right? Mm-hmm. These are the asparagus, right? And having those conversations that then translate into the home. So the environmental print concept of being able to say, hey, do you recognize this street? Right? And finding other opportunities, because reading is not just sit down, be quiet, read this book, mm-hmm. right? Reading is having a conversation at dinner. Reading is, we go to the store, can you find your own size? You know what I mean? So it's this idea that it's a world, it's a skill that is so universal that we don't even realize how powerful it can really be because we silence it so often.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I love that you shared that supermarket story, because it really is true. It's, when you go to the supermarket, and I remember it's been 20, 25 years since my kids were small enough to sit in the carriage in the grocery store. But we would go through and we would identify things and ask, what would you like? What do you think should we have this? Should we have this? And pointing out things, and, hey, can you find a can with an A on it? And I was able to do that because my beautiful wife and I had positions that gave us the time, the beauty, the gift of time to be in there and spend that time with our kids. And again, thankfully, we weren't in that situation, but I absolutely know single parents who don't have that time, who have to go in there and rush through the store and don't have time to point things out. And, you mentioned the pandemic. One thing I think that we all experienced early on is this idea that we're all going through this storm called the pandemic together, but we weren't in the same boats. And,
right.
I pray that we remember that, that as we're coming out of the pandemic, I really, really pray that we remember that and we have some empathy for folks who aren't in as luxurious a boat as we're in, and find ways to elevate everybody so that every kid has the experience of growing up with a parent who can walk casually through a grocery store and, you know, and have conversations about what's on the shelves and what can starts with the letter A.
Yeah, I mean, and it's even more accessible than that, right? You know, you mentioned time, or, you know, just the comfort rather, you know, of being able to just have that as a luxury, right? But a lot of times I may not have mentioned this, but I incorporated a small nonprofit that works in DC. And last year we did our first summer programming with the National Center for Children and Families. And it's all wrapped around literacy and written expression and, you know, and exciting children about reading from 6 years old all the way to 14, right? So what Generation Forward is responsible for during those summer engagement sessions for the 6 weeks is really making it clear that you may be in a particular situation, whether it's financial, whether it's your own education, but there are some very easy steps for parents to follow that may not have the know-how, right? I would imagine that the things that you were doing in the grocery store and other places were almost second nature to you because it may have been passed down. You may have observed it somewhere. It may have been an experiential approach to, you know, these are the things that I think are helpful and healthy. But families that don't necessarily know don't do, right? So a part of this as teachers, we are responsible for also, unfortunately, in some cases, it seems like a heavier lift, but we've got to be able to communicate with our parents to let them know, like, hey, these are 3 things you guys can do for the next couple of weeks, right? As opposed to just being so bogged down with the day-to-day that we don't remember that everyone doesn't have that same experience, and that for some parents, school was not a place of comfort. School was not a place of success. And, you know, sometimes parents feel like it's me versus the school versus as opposed to the school being a partner with the, you know, within the raising of the children in terms of it being a village.
Yeah. My beautiful wife just retired after teaching in the Boston Public Schools for 34 years. And that is
congrats to her.
Yeah, thank you. That is one of the biggest things that she noticed in the decades that she taught. Whereas, you know, when she first came on board, there was that sense of a partnership with the parents. And then towards the end of her career, it was, you know, parents, it was almost as if parents came in looking for a fight. You could be calling home to say, hey, your kid did a good job, but they would see the number, you know, that the call was coming from the school, and the first thing, and the defenses would be up, and what are you calling for? And, you know, that's just not a healthy situation. We have to figure out ways to build that partnership back where parents feel comfortable, feel like they're a valued part of the educational team.
Yeah, and one way that I've tried to do that, you know, whether or not the amount of success is worth mentioning, but it's just inviting parents in, man. It's really just letting them know, like, what I'm doing in this classroom is no secret. You know, if you have, you know, any expertise in, let's say, you know, we want to talk about building the whole child, right? So you have families that have different jobs and careers. Come on in September and talk about, you know, working for the post office. Come on in and talk about, you know, the fact that you wanted to start a salon and maybe you didn't get it off the ground, but, you know, like, share your aspirations within that community. Because one thing that I noticed, like you mentioned, is that pushback really for myself, it almost seems like it comes from a place of almost like embarrassment almost, right? It's like, oh, my child might not be the best in that room. But I'm trying to figure out, where does that even come from, right? Is it a standardized testing thing? Is it a, you know, subconscious thing to where people are just really traumatized from their own experiences? And really being transparent myself has helped a lot. You know, I myself was a struggling reader up until middle school, high school. Just thankfully I had the right support. But imagine if you're not supported. Imagine if school is that place, you know, of tension and failure and lack of quote unquote opportunity, right? So it gets to the point where, we end up playing parent and teacher at the same time. And there's no way we can replace a parent, regardless of how disconnected we think a parent is, because no parent sends their child to school and says, go in there and don't do your best today.
Right. Yeah. So let's get back to the Crunchy Life series. How many books are in the series?
Originally, there were 5 that take you through the beginning of the school year, where Charles, his classroom teacher, Mrs. Brown, she quits in the beginning of the year. And just like some other failed relationships, he's like, oh my goodness, here's another lady that is going to give up on me and my classmates. So imagine that Michael Jordan or LeBron James becomes the classroom teacher. And that's what happens in the Crunchy Life series in the first book, where Tyrone Leroy, who's this fictional superstar in the NFL, he becomes the classroom teacher. So that journey takes you through books 1 through 5. So then the 6th book is the prequel to the Crunchy Life series, which is all about Tyrone Leroy's backstory. Because one of my buddies was like, why would this NFL superstar guy quit making millions in the pros to become a teacher in the projects, basically? And long story short, I had to give my readers an opportunity to see, the heart of Mr. Leroy and what influenced him as a kid to get over some of his challenges to then become a teacher later on. And then book 7 is one of the main characters. Her name is Aaliyah, and she tells the entire same school year, 5th grade, but she tells it from her perspective, and it's in poetic format. And then we start to branch off from Crunchy Life, and we go on to Crunchy Life Junior, which is all about Charles's sister, who is jealous now that Crunchy is getting all this attention. The media has come to school. Colin Kaepernick, fictionally, in a fictional way, comes to visit in book 3 during Black History Month. So she's starting, to tell her own story now. And then, we have a couple opportunities to branch off with other kids, and there's going to be, and there already is, but there's a time traveling spinoff with Daniel and Caleb, who are 3rd graders who go to Charles's school, who go to elite public charter school, but their backstory is the fact that there's conflicts in their classroom centered around social injustices. And for example, whenever something happens, Miss Robinson, who's the teacher, Daniel gets made fun of by a white student in class because he's dark skinned. Pretty cliche, but here's why that matters. As soon as Mrs. Brown, who's their teacher, suggests a solution to that problem, she uses a historical figure from the past as an example as to why we shouldn't have those type of conflicts. Don't you know that Dr. King and all these other people fought so we can get along? So as soon as she mentions Dr. King, the timer starts, and Daniel and Kayla have to use their smartwatches that their grandfather created when he was a scientist at Howard University to go back to 1937 to help Martin Luther King, who's 8-year-old Martin, get over stage fright, or else everything will come undone and we'll go back into like this pre-civil rights 2020 apocalyptic world that we don't want to happen, right? So Daniel, and I'll be brief with this, but Daniel has another moment where he wants to play on the AAA baseball team, but only the wealthy kids in the suburbs make the team. So one of the kids says, man, what you think, you little broke butt? Your family can't afford to play on this baseball team. As a black player, Mrs. Robinson is going to say, Jackie Robinson and others broke the color barrier for you guys to be able to play in the same league. But as soon as she mentions that, we got to go back in time to Irvine, California, to make sure Jackie is not afraid to get up to bat. So there's these scenarios that have to kind of be to help, Kayla and Daniel have to guide the historical figure through their own childhood issue in order for the world to become what it is. So in that story, they're going to start seeing that like the NBA and the NFL is only full of white players, right? So slowly they're like, oh my goodness, we only got 8 hours left. We got to go find Jackie Robinson and help him get over being afraid to get up at bat. So the premise behind Crunchy Life is there's traditional fairy tales tied throughout the whole series, which is, it's not just a story about a 10-year-old boy in DC who's going through trouble, right? A quick one, and then I'll let kind of allow us to move on. But just a beautiful example of this is when Charles wants to go play basketball, in book 5 during the Mother's Day basketball tournament in Southeast. His grandfather is no longer living, so he doesn't have anyone to organize his team. So instead, he has to go over to the babysitter's house, but her 2 sons get to go play ball, kind of like Cinderella. Mm-hmm. He's left to clean up after the sleepover. He can't go. But Mr. Leroy comes to the rescue in his nice fancy Jeep with a couple other kids from his class, Calvin and Jamal, and Darnell and the other guys on the team. They pick Charles up, and then they go play basketball. But during the basketball game, Jamal gets blown by on the court like his legs are made out of straw. Calvin gets blown by like his legs are made out of sticks. So he does a little better playing defense. But then Crunchy stops the kid Sindel from scoring as if his legs are made out of bricks. So it ties in, the 3 Little Pigs. Oh. So you'll hear Goldilocks, you'll hear Beauty and the Beast, you'll hear the Gingerbread Man. They're all the traditional fairy tales are all wrapped up in the Crunchy Life series, but they're just told from different perspectives in real life scenarios, which is just amazing. And this stuff came to me, kind of all in 1 week during a spring break during 2018 or so. And I stayed home from work for a whole 2 weeks, and I was like stuck in the room just typing.
Well, this sounds so much fun. It's, I'm imagining back when I was in 5th grade, and I can imagine just trying to binge every single one of those books at the library. So that's really wonderful. One of the things that I do when I have an educator on, especially a passionate educator like you, I mentioned before we started that I do educational magic shows around the country. If this was my magic wand and I was able to give it to you and you could wave it to make schools in our education system better, what would you do?
I'd take away standardized testing, man, in every facet. I would use benchmark assessments to gauge whether or not students are developing as thinkers, as readers and writers, and as mathematicians in a sense, but not necessarily to take pressure off the kids, right? I think kids need to have moments where they're quote unquote under the gun or have pressures on them just to develop their character, but more so to relieve teachers of just the burden and the stress of an assessment that sometimes they could teach their butts off and kids still may have other challenges that compete for their attention that might not show that a teacher is actually that effective, kind of hurt their reputation or their profile as an educator. I know firsthand, man, that I worked in a couple buildings where, folks taught as if every child in that room was their own child. And, to some extent, the progress was very slow, to the point where the assessment tool used to score teachers, the observational tools used to score teachers, doesn't necessarily mirror the effort that teachers are really putting in. Mm-hmm. So it's a tricky idea that, yes, we need to hold teachers accountable. We are, professionals. We are, quote unquote, the experts in the eyes of certain people. But we're human at the end of the day, right? And it's unfortunate sometimes that we have people walking away, caring, trusted professionals walking away because of a rubric, and that's one thing that that's at the top of my list. If I had a magic wand, I'll just try to change the culture,
And it didn't take you any time. A lot of times I'll ask authors or teachers that, and they go, well, but you were right away, boom, standardized test, disappear.
Yeah. I've had conversations, man. I talk about, these conversations this is what I do, so for me, that's a no-brainer for me.
Hey, Glenn, tell everybody where they can go to find out more about you and find out more about the Crunchy Life series, please. Yeah,
so my first name is Glenn with one N. That's the proper way to spell Glenn. Mm-hmm. Maybe not. But everything that I do in terms of our nonprofit that supports students in D.C., my school visits that I go on myself around the country, speaking engagements, literacy nights that I produce for schools up and down the East Coast, all of my information, the Crunchy Life series, videos, interviews from ABC and NBC and Fox 5 and all of that good stuff. It's all at Glen Mourning Cares, like I care about you, glenmourningcares.com.
Awesome. We've had a really wonderful time speaking to the author of the Crunchy Life series, a great middle grade series, especially for kids who are reluctant readers or struggling readers. And our guest has been the author, Glen Mourning. Hey, Glen, thanks so much for being with us.
All right. I look forward to all the work that you continue to do, man. This is awesome, and I thank you so much for having me on tonight.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Eric Wilkinson. He is the illustrator of I Color Myself Different, the new picture book written by Colin Kaepernick. That's the next episode of the podcast. Want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to start by thanking our guest, Glen Mourning. Please be sure to check out his Crunchy Life middle grade novel series. Also want to thank our sponsor, Scott Feld, Dax to the Max. Check it out today. Also want to thank William Wilberforce III. Be sure to check out Vroom, Barry Carey, and the Power Boost. I want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Skylar Strauss. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.